These notes are on carbon. So carbon is on the periodic table as symbol C. It's on the right side toward the top, and it's atomic number 6. So carbon is pretty important in living things, as we'll see later on, but it's also in other things, like your pencil lead is not actually made of lead, it's made of carbon, graphite. Carbon can also be in charcoal, and carbon is what diamonds are made of, so carbon can bond in lots of different ways. Carbon has 4 electrons on the outside, you can see those 4 red dots, that allow it to bond to up to 4 other things. And that's kind of a big deal, because that means it can make 4 different bonds. So it could do 4 individual bonds where it bonds to 4 different things, or it could do 2 double bonds, or a triple bond and a single bond, or a double bond and 2 single bonds. So there's lots of different ways that carbon can make bonds, and those 4 bonds are called tetravalents, where tetra means 4. Those bonds that carbon forms, they're very secure. They don't fall apart easily. So everything that carbon bonds with is very stable. It will stay together, which is a good thing for living things and all these molecules that we have that involve carbon. So, speaking of bonds, these 3 aren't necessarily just for carbon or just any kind of atomic bond. We'll come back to carbon here in a few minutes. But atoms can form 3 kinds of bonds. The first kind of bond is called a covalent bond. And in a covalent bond, the atoms share the electrons. So the electrons will be with both atoms equally. I'm going to flip forward, but I'll come right back. When you have a covalent bond, that is 2 nonmetals, which are all the green ones here. Whenever 2 or more of those green ones come together, that'll get you a covalent bond. An ionic bond, instead of sharing electrons, an ionic bond, one atom takes the electrons from the other. It's usually a metal and a non-metal. I'm flipping forward again. All the blue ones are metals, and the green ones are the nonmetals. So an example of an ionic bond would be sodium chloride or table salt. That is sodium, which is Na, it's a metal, and chlorine, which is Cl, and it's a nonmetal. And what happens when those 2 bond is the sodium gives up an electron and chlorine takes it, and by doing that, they get bonded together. The last one, hydrogen bonds, that's pretty easy. It's between hydrogen and something else, but hydrogen bonds aren't quite the same as any other bonds because they're very weak. They fall apart very easily. Whereas covalent bonds and ionic bonds are very strong. They're not going to fall apart. Hydrogen bonds break and reform all the time. And we'll see more with hydrogen bonds when we see water later on. So if we have some atoms and we want to put them together to make a molecule, there are a couple different ways you could go about that. These are 2 ways that you can make a molecule. One way on the left is synthesis, where you take 2 atoms, put them together to make a bond. Like that's what happens with water. You just have H's, O's, put them together, they make H2O. Now sometimes you have to have a little bit more of a chemical reaction than that. There has to be like another step in between. They won't just go together like hydrogen and oxygen would. And dehydration, the full name of that would be dehydration synthesis, but dehydration happens when water is removed to bond the 2 atoms together. So in this one, it's a little more complicated looking, but it's still basically a bond. It's doing the same thing. But what's happening is you can see the red O and the 2 red H's. They're going to be taken out. they're removed. But in its place, there will be a bond between C and N, just down in this area. So this O and these two H's go away. They become H2O, water. And in their place, now these two big molecules are bonded together. So synthesis is kind of a individual atom sort of thing. It's a smaller sort of combination. Whereas dehydration is for two bigger molecules getting combined together. Back to carbon. So carbon specifically, it forms covalent bonds. Because remember that carbon is a non-metal, so it's going to form covalent bonds. And if you remember from yesterday, CHONPS, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, those are all non-metals too, so they all form nice strong covalent bonds. So what's the rest of these notes involves is we're going to do kind of a quick intro to the important biomolecules. We're going to have another day where we go into them more in depth, so don't worry about trying to write down everything. This is just kind of an intro to them. And this does not include water, because water does not have carbon in it. So water will get its own day in a few days, but these are all the ones that do have carbon. Carbohydrates. They're called that because they have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So carbo is carbon, hydrates is hydrogen, oxygen. Carbohydrates are used for energy, mostly. Some of them are used for structure. Examples would be sugars, and cellulose is an example of a structure one. So we'll see more with carbohydrates in another day. Lipids are also carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they tend to have more carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. They tend to be bigger molecules than carbohydrates. And lipids are also used for energy, but they're more often used for energy storage. So like fat is energy storage in your body. Other examples would be oils, waxes. The lipids are all grouped together because none of them like water. Like if you put oil with water, it doesn't go together very well. Oop, sorry. Why will not show our last one? Let's see. There's our last one. We'll just do it this way. Our last set of biomolecules, proteins, are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen again, and we add in nitrogen. And proteins do things for cells. So if your cell needs to move or move something in or out of the cell, that's a protein. You can think of muscle proteins. There's proteins in cell membranes that tell cells when to do things and how to do them. There are proteins that break down your food and put together molecules for you. There are proteins that even help build DNA. So if there's a job to be done, the protein does it. And lastly, the nucleic acids, which are the CHON and the P. Examples of nucleic acids would be DNA, RNA, and ATP. So you should know what DNA is, I hope. RNA is related to DNA. ATP is an energy molecule that we'll see more in the next unit. So you'll have whole units coming up on DNA, RNA, and ATP. So for now, again, the biomolecules, we were just introducing them and knowing what their names are. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Tomorrow's notes will be looking more specifically at each one. So for today, what you need to take away is how carbon bonds and why that's important, why these molecules are important.